Hey everybody, we're back. This is Media Ciphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. Also, quick reminder, we still got the Media Ciphers podcast out there, and we're also putting our stuff on YouTube as well. And worth mentioning, because I was just thinking of this the other day, looking at the new video we put up. YouTube does this nice thing where they do automatic captions, which if you're like me and you have some hearing damage, maybe that is a better way for people to catch the show, people with hearing impairments, so you can still keep in touch with what we're talking about without necessarily being able to hear us. So that is something I'd point out to you if maybe you have friends out there in the community who they have those radical politics, but maybe it's difficult for them to tune into an audio podcast or show. So this next section, Nora is joining us. Nora, how are you doing on this? At least here in Michigan, it's a pretty beautiful day.
Yeah, it's nice and warm here in Chicago as well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks again for coming on. So we're going to launch in. We've got another Michigan story, and then we're going to kind of talk about some more national and international issues. This one, so this is a story that we've been talking about on the show, kind of updating regularly about what is going on in Ottawa County. And just a quick summation, folks maybe you haven't been following it super closely. Ottawa, in the most recent elections, they were really like a hotspot in Michigan as far as this attempt from right-wing forces, kind of proto-fascist forces, to get their people in. It was kind of the slate of far-right extremists from the Ottawa Impact, and some of the first things they did when they got elected, they axed the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and recently they passed a resolution that makes Ottawa a quote-unquote constitutional county. I think it's worth unpacking in the show, this episode, specifically what that means and how that relates to their politics. So just very briefly, I'm going to tell you what happened. So on Tuesday, May 23rd, this is a little while ago, but we didn't really get a chance to cover it, by 9-1 vote. That is, Ottawa became a quote unquote constitutional county, which is really more symbolic than anything else. It doesn't really skirt their ability to enforce or not enforce certain laws. But I think it's important to talk about, particularly in the context of where they're coming from. This so a lot of it is mostly centered on Second Amendment stuff, gun rights. You'll notice if you actually read the article, that's where a lot of the back and forth was coming between detractors who came to speak to the commission and the people on the commission. But this isn't just some weird idea that Ottawa County pulled out of their hat. This actually relates to a broader, what you call constitutional county or sheriff's movement. Sheriff movements in particular has a lot of historical context around it, which is basically this kind of right-wing, kind of stems from a lot of the militia movement. The idea of sheriff's departments or counties saying that we will adhere to what is in quote the Constitution rather than local laws, and this most often takes the forms of gun and land rights. But as it's kind of commingled with the culture wars, we've also seen it kind of be used as an inroad against LGBTQ and other religious rights. And it's something that's been tied pretty closely to National Sheriff's Movement and the Oath Keepers and other kind of far right paramilitary organization as this sort of political tactic. So Nora, I know you mentioned we want to kind of open up and discuss this. So I kind of laid out the context, and I was kind of curious, kind of what your thoughts might be on it.
Yeah, so this kind of hits home to me because I grew up in Ottawa County, actually. I lived there for like a good chunk of my life. I know that like a big reason behind their motivation for this whole constitutional county thing is to, strengthen gun rights. 'Cause that's one of the, hardest lines that the American right will try to toe. but I think it's another example of how, you know, governments at, let's say, a lower level will try to get around, governments at a higher level. And like, I guess both sides of the government will do this. For example, when Trump got elected, a lot of sanctuary city laws popped up in order to, counteract certain, federal attacks on immigration. But this is like more of something like that for the right. They're trying to go against, they're using this really like right-wing interpretation of like the Constitution, but only the original one, you know, like back when people could still be property and only white dudes who owned a ton of land could vote. So it's really concerning what they'll try to get away with here. I don't think they'll get away with that much, but that's yet to be seen. It's still very concerning, especially just knowing how many conspiracy theorists were recently elected into the Ottawa County government.
Yeah, yeah, and it kind of loops into some of what we were talking about on a previous show, where it's like if you view your political opponents less as political opponents, as more as some sort of like dangerous existential threat, then you are going to react, and more importantly, your base is going to react more aggressively and violently to your political opponents. So kind of this whole framing that the Ottawa County Commission are going to protect your constitutional rights from big city liberals, the deep state, etc. While at the same time, you realize like who these people actually work for, like rights for whom, based on what. There are a lot of rights in the Constitution that they are diametrically against. I mean, later on the show we're going to be talking about the rights of asylum seekers and immigrants. So, it would be kind of fun to go to one of these meetings and it's like okay, so you're going to you want to protect people in your county from the tyrannical government, right? Okay, well, so how about the immigrants who are being tyrannically terrorized by ICE? Or say like the Black Lives Matter protesters who are expressing their First Amendment rights. Would you be sure to
Exactly.
protect their constitutional rights? The answer
Speaking
would
of
probably
which, this is only kind of related, like, but I did see that New York City had to pay a massive settlement to Black Lives Matter protesters who participated in the 2020 uprising because of all the violence that they experienced at the hands of the NYPD. So yeah, these are all like kind of connected in a way. It's just another way to illustrate that.
Yeah, and like I kind of say the previous point because I have talked to a couple of people who, it's like, well, what's wrong with trying to adhere to the Constitution? And Nora, as you pointed out, like the original document has some problems, but even if you were to take it at face value, oh, okay, so it's following the Constitution. Keep in mind, this is more of a like a rhetorical strategy on their end. It's not sincere. It's not actually about protecting the rights of citizens from government overreach. It's to kind of again fire up their base in the culture war. Again, they talk about rights. They're more concerned with these kind of petty bourgeois reactionary rights, the rights not to wear a mask, the rights the rights of gun owners, etc. And when you're talking about actual human rights violations that occur against their ideological opponents, it's very much speaking both sides out of their mouths. Oh, we've got to protect constitutional rights while simultaneously banning books, or as they did recently, invite an active shooter to come have brunch with them. A lot of the same people overlap.
Oh man, you want to talk about that story too? Did that already happen, or is that like still in the future?
That already happened, and I covered it a couple weeks ago. But I do have some postscript to it, which is there were some pictures from the event, and I counted about maybe 20, 25 people, but not a big turnout, and definitely not seemed like a lot of kind of silver-haired boomer types. So yeah, if the far right is trying to hitch their wagon to Kyle Rittenhouse as some sort of charismatic leader, I don't know. That doesn't seem like it's going to work out.
Charismatic.
Yeah. like I said, I reported, if this kid could have had a future in donut commercials, but and again, not body shaming. He looks like a food mascot, but he literally looks like the Pillsbury Doughboy. But
I was gonna say he looks like the big boy from the Big Boy Burgers.
yeah, yeah, just all the overdone makeup and stuff. Anyway, um, but yeah, I think it's important to point out like these are the types of ideas that are kind of baked in to this constitutional county thing. And although the main discussion has been kind of like gun control versus not, I think it's important for listeners to understand there's a lot of other things that bleed into here. And primarily what it is it's the right trying to, again, tap into that American mythology. The Constitution is kind of a holy document and use it as kind of a weapon in their culture wars. It doesn't have very much to actually do with the Constitution or people's rights, as much as it is just more kind of political theater for the core of their base that is really fired up by this type of stuff. So yeah, it's important to understand kind of the propaganda angle these people are coming from, and also just like the elements of the far right this comes from. It comes from a lot of that conspiratorial sovereign citizen movement type stuff that again is New World Order, World Economic Forum, all that stuff, which we could do a whole episode on like the difference between like critiquing capitalism and engaging conspiracy theory, but that is all wrapped up in this idea that this big international entity is going to infringe on the rights of like Ottawa County or wherever, which could very much happen, but that's again a product of capitalism. That's what stuff like the World Economic Forum is really about, is keeping neoliberal capitalism on life support. But it's much better for people on the right to frame them as some sort of potentially communistic boogeyman to fire up their base. And it works pretty well in the United States, which again has a pretty long-standing reactionary tradition. But that is what it is. And I think it's important to delve a little bit deeper, even just beyond the sort of single issue stuff that they tap into, like gun rights and stuff.
Exactly. And I think this also kind of ties into like a lot of conservative strategy for trying to portray themselves as anti-establishment when they're the most establishment, because a lot of people like don't like, like the people don't like fascism. And if like a lot of people are against that, a lot of right wingers are gonna feel like that they're like going against the big guy when they're the big guy,
Yeah, exactly. And it goes back to that long history of people who are primarily white and middle income, kind of hitching their wagon to that sort of like white colonial project versus other workers. So really one of the big reasons it's been so hard to get kind of long-standing revolutionary movements off the ground here in the States. So again, it's all part of that history. We're seeing that play out here in the state of Michigan, over in Ottawa. And yeah, it's worth deconstructing a little bit so that we can understand what's really going on and what they're really doing. So talking about the commissioners in Ottawa do a lot of hemming and hawing and scaremongering about the government infringing on people's rights. And the government certainly is doing that. And I think this next story me and you wanted to hit on can kind of break down in detail exactly how the tyrannical government is being tyrannical. There's been several stories recently about immigration issues. And Nora, thank you for bringing the attention. We've got one here in the Midwest. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Texas too. But Nora, I was wondering maybe you could kick us off with the story you're talking about from Chicago, which I think a lot of people, a lot of Michiganders forget. Most of the news we hear is from the southern border, but Michigan and the Chicagoland area are both really big immigration hubs. And actually, because of the border, Michigan is in like the entire state is an ice zone, and so is Chicago because it's
Yes.
Lake Michigan is right there. So
For some reason they consider the very bottom of the Great Lakes to also be a border, but I guess you could technically say it is. But this is my, I guess, more has to do with like primarily immigration coming from Central and South America. So as some of you might have heard previously, um, a lot of how do we want to start this? So now let's start with like I guess the more national angle to it. So a lot of it's been coming out that a lot of women in ICE jails, which mostly are private prisons, by the way, people are making money off of that. A lot of these women will face sexual abuse from doctors, guards, people who might work there in general. And there's very little they can do because if you like are undocumented or underdocumented and you're already in an ICE jail, you're not going to have very many rights that would normally be granted to a U.S. citizen that wouldn't be in any type of jail. So, and you hear all these like horrific accounts of like how many times these guys can get away with it. And there's a really great but like really kind of disturbing story on Democracy Now on like what that's looking like and how there's very little punishment for the perpetrators of that, like how they'll get like rotated to different ICE jails or to different positions or with different people. And it's like it's kind of similar to like what you'd expect from like a Catholic Church scandal in that regard. However, that issue came more locally, as in Chicago, as there's been a huge influx of immigrants coming to Chicago specifically. And a big reason that this happened in the first place is because states like Texas and Florida are making a big political show to human traffic. Let's not mince words here. They're lying to immigrants about like get on a bus or a plane that'll give them jobs or food or whatever, and then they drop them off in like a liberal city with no resources at all. And Chicago is one of those places. And thankfully to the credit of the our city governments, they were able to pass a bill offering $50 million of city funds in order to help get them housed, like temporarily housed, resettled, give them things like clothes, cleaning supplies, personal hygiene items, etc. And but still, like a lot of new shelters had to be opened, and more still of immigrants had to sleep on floors of police locations, police offices. So you can probably imagine where this is going. There was a couple of Chicago police officers that investigated for abusing migrant youth who were forced to sleep in the stations. And one of them, one of them was like raped by a police officer and got pregnant. So it's been like a whole mess. And while the funding for helping resettle the immigrants was controversial in the first place, it's still a drop in the bucket compared to what Chicago offers the CPD. And a lot of people who would have opposed the immigrant funding are being awful quiet about this now. I wonder why. And it's like you see articles about it. Thankfully, it is getting reported, but a lot of I guess establishment news sources in the city will use more neutral languages, like the officer impregnated a migrant, like not mentioning that it wasn't consensual and the migrant was a teenager. Like this is this is really gross, upsetting stuff, and like this is an opportunity to protect children in real life, and our city is just not doing that, and we should consider other options for housing these migrants away from the police system.
I think I kind of want to bounce off something you said, especially focusing on the way media approaches these issues, as is part of the tagline of our show. And it's kind of, the way that some of this stuff kind of gets whitewashed. And you referred to like that. It reminded me very much of like the way Western reporting covers something like the Israeli Palestine conflict. They'll say, "Oh, Palestinian reporter gets hit by bullet," not killed by Israeli soldier, so on and so forth. And it's all kind of trying to use this neutral language. And we've actually seen this a lot more since President Biden was elected. anybody who follows immigration issues know that a lot of the same infringements on human rights that are going on under Trump are still going on under Biden. But some of the very same like places that were used to house immigrants in terrible conditions, are now getting described in these more neutral and sometimes flowery terms, like, um, and something I noticed, especially as so part of the story. So Greg, you talk about Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, has recently more political theater, just doing like really gross edicts to his cronies about like deliberately withholding water from, and it even says in the writing, infants. Also, recently putting these barbed wire barrels in the Rio Grande River.
Yeah, the Department of Justice had to sue Texas over that, and Greg Abbott said, "No, we're still going to go through this. We'll see you in court."
Mhm. And something that can people we can forget is that the immigration crisis is the result of decades of anti-immigrant policymaking and neoliberalism. Like Central America, South America, Mexico, they deal with poverty and, in some cases, authoritarian regimes for a reason. And I know it's almost a cliche on a leftist talk show. It's like, well, it's America's fault, but yeah, it is. It's decades of intervention in South and Central America, and NAFTA. Those sorts of things have led to the conditions that cause immigrants to have to flee those countries. And piling up the cruelty at the southern border does a couple of things for people on the far right. It drums up their base. It's like, yeah, you're being cruel to the people you want me to be cruel to. But I think also for a lot of more liberal media, it gives us something like, really, it's like the good cop bad cop routine. You can focus on what the really bad cop is doing in the Rio Grande with, like, barbed wire stuff. And in a way, it's easier to ignore when the Biden administration, like, extends Title 42 or sleeps on its campaign promises to reform the immigration system, even though that is what is driving immigration in the first place. And bad news for people like Greg Abbott, until you change those underlying economic conditions that is causing that, immigration will continue. And of course, there's always been the historical push and pull in the American capitalism, where they need that cheap labor force, but you also need immigrants as like this demonized other that you can whip out whenever it's convenient, either for elections or what have you. But yeah, it's where all of this is coming out to kind of at a time where we hadn't necessarily seen a lot of coverage of immigration issues. It's kind of slid into the background. Even as I said, there's still a lot of continuing issues with it, and often in the media it's framed, even in like kind of the centrist media, as like, oh, how's Biden going to deal with this politically? All the far right people want to be crueler to immigrants, and people on the far left want him to treat them like humans. Whatever will Joseph Biden do? And they find some sort of terrible middle solution where it's like, okay, well, we'll still treat them bad, but we'll give all the kids an Xbox. But that's based on a story where they were responding to criticism. This is post-Trump, of like one of their concentration camps, and it's like they mentioned, like, oh yeah, we put an Xbox in the kids' room.
Oh man.
That doesn't change like, okay, great, these terrified kids can play Halo, but I think they need a little bit more than that. So
Need like
yeah.
beds and a place to go to the bathroom and a place to wash themselves and to not get abused or harassed by guards. Like, letting them play Fortnite is not going to solve this.
No, and especially that really chilling story from Vox which I think most of it could guess that, and we've seen other stories come out about this, like sexual abuse in the concentration camps. But it really hits home that, like, you're seeing this outpour of reporting of this really like persistent issue of, it's not surprising though. So you have people who have been ideologically trained to not really view these people as fully human. So you'll have people like that doctor who feel like they can just do whatever they want to these people. And again, that's a cultural and institutional problem that it really needs to be approached, from that angle. You're not going to fix it necessarily just by like getting somebody to replace Greg Abbott, because say Texas gets a Democratic governor in the next couple of years. Who knows? Stranger things have happened. Maybe they'll remove the barbed wire barrels, but what are we going to do to actually help asylum seekers? That always seems to be
Exactly.
where people go to a full stop.
I think you're asking a lot of the right questions there. I think it is really telling just how much how like things like deportations and detentions have like largely increased under Biden, but again, it's easier to ignore. So it seems like he already is taking the centrist position of still treating them poorly, but not tweeting it about it every 5 minutes
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
Xing about it or whatever the whatever that website's going to call itself now.
Yeah, like under Obama, any immigration activists will say they called him the deporter in chief, and he invented some really cool things like the no knock night raids and all of that. But yeah, he wasn't tweeting about it. It's Americans, a lot of more liberal Americans did not like the cruelty of American empire thrown in their face every day on Twitter. And well, we do have a president that doesn't do that anymore, but that doesn't mean the cruelty is gone. It's still there. It just it's what is it? It's cruelty with I see you and I hear you at the end of the sentence.
Man.
Yeah.
It's I think it's kind of tied into like Biden nominating what was that guy like this really bad war criminal. It's like this kind of honorary position, but still like it really shows you what side he's on with these issues.
Elliot
That's the
Abrams,
one.
and so it's not completely a non sequitur because Elliot Abrams was instrumental in the Iran Contra scandal and helping facilitate a lot of fascist paramilitaries down there to go and extinguish leftist governments or leftist people's movements. So yeah, Elliot Abrams, who was responsible for that, is still in the good graces of the Biden administration. I'm like one of when some of you may remember when Ilhan Omar was one of the first things that really went viral when she was in Congress. She had a heated exchange with Elliot Abrams, basically, literally just telling the guy what he did. He got very upset about that. But yeah, that kind of shows you if you want to really put a finger on the pulse of like the consciousness and the conscience of the people currently in charge. There it is. A lot of rhetoric, but in action, putting the same people who create the literal same people who created the immigration crisis in the good graces of the government. And yeah, until we as the people change that, we're not going to fix these problems for immigrants or for us or for anybody else for that matter.
Exactly.
All right, so kind of talking about the nascent American fascism to something a little bit more international. And I guess I'm wearing the right shirt for it today because we're about to talk about Ukrainian neo-Nazis. And I want to kind of do a preface to this, which is interesting because so the last time we talked about this was right around when the conflict was first starting. And it was almost more like trying to talk to fellow travelers on the left, being like, hey, the entire Ukrainian population is not fascist. They like there's nuances to this, and yes, Ukraine does have a Nazi problem that's real, but we can't go too far in the other direction. Understand like this was kind of for the average working people of Ukraine, this was an unchecked war on them. And people, we should not poo-poo people engaging in self-defense. And as there's great short episode of Rev Left Radio. I'm sorry if not too far off topic, but they talked to a socialist workers group from Ukraine, and they spell it out, which is again, it's Russian oligarchs and Ukrainian oligarchs, and the Ukrainian workers are largely just stuck in the middle. So what's happened since then? We're doing kind of temperature check, and want to thank Nora for bringing this to my attention. Democracy Now! Just did a really great report on this. But from there to here, it'd be very interesting to look at the way that Azov Battalion, which quick summation, they've existed for a decade and some change now. Far right, literal neo-Nazi group. They embrace Hitler, Steve Bandera, a famous Ukrainian Nazi. The iconography, the storm belts thing, and they've been active for about a decade. And so what this report really talks about is the way that the Western media has done like a complete 180 on Azov Battalion since the war started. And even to an extent, like, I kind of expected, that we might get a little bit of that historical erasure, but even to the extent that I've seen it happen, it's still a little surprising to me. So what the report especially talks about is how, mainstream media outlet after outlet, you can look at their coverage of Ukraine and the Azov Battalion from roughly, like, you start in 2014, the Maidan coup to now, and there's a lot of alarm bells being rung about, hey, the Azov Battalion, they are literally neo-Nazis, being incorporated in the Ukrainian military. We are perhaps funding and training them with our tax dollars. This is really alarming, etc. And then Putin invades, and it's a dead stop. And what we've seen is those very same outlets not only ignoring the previous coverage of Azov, but really rehabilitating them. A lot of outlets saying like, oh, they used to be Nazi, now they're not. And very short of evidence on how Azov denazified itself. But I wanted to read just like a quick little quote from that article that kind of sums up a lot of the kind of hypocrisy coming out of the media and how this is playing out politically over in Ukraine. So this is from The Nation. It's one of the authors that or journalists got interviewed on Democracy Now! The Western media is whitewashing the Azov Battalion. And he said here, really stuck with me. There is a kernel of truth in the allegations that Azov is just a Russian bogeyman. The Kremlin and Ukraine's neo-Nazis have a symbiotic relationship that reaches to the very heart of this war. Putin needed a pretext to justify his illegal invasion, and for that, he turned to Azov. Moscow seized on Azov's existence to paint all of Ukraine as a cesspool of fascism, although there's probably pretty good fashion in Ukraine, but I digress. Ukraine as a cesspool of fascism in need of denazification. Azov really is the linchpin in Putin's narrative. In turn, Azov's defenders have capitalized on Russia's obsession by implying that anyone who criticizes Azov Battalion is a Putin apologist. Moscow and Azov use each other to defend the indefensible. For Russia, it's acceptable to invade a sovereign country to fight neo-Nazis. For the West, it's appropriate to lionize neo-Nazis because they're fighting Russia.
I might be remembering this wrong, but didn't the Azov Battalion get funded by the U.S. as like a pro-NATO group in the first place? That's kind of yeah, that's something I remember hearing about. And like there is a way that you can support you can support Ukraine without like being pro-Azov, but like a lot of these establishment figures aren't like doing the due diligence of separating the two from each other or bothering to report that it's a thing at all. Which if you would look up stuff about Ukraine before the war, it would be hard to not see, pun intended, stuff about it would be difficult not to see stuff about the fact that they have like a Nazi insurgency within like they're like this within this paramilitary movement within their country. And it's another example of why like the US trying to poke the nuclear bear with Russia and push more of its borders, like the countries that border it to join NATO is going to have like, you know, the unintended consequence of like, you know, making Russia more aggressive. Perhaps that's what they want because, you know, it's more excuse to give money to defense contractors. But this is, you would hope that like, you know, your country wouldn't do something like this, like, so, you know, like giving money to international Nazi groups. But there's few things that the US won't do to continue its empire. And it's really upsetting to see. And yeah, hopefully something will be done about it, but I don't know. Like,
Yeah,
it's hard to see it's hard to see a concrete way out unless Zelensky decides to just shove them all at the front line specifically, I guess.
yeah, and I really encourage everybody read the full article. We'll link to it in the show notes, but it is really just, and I know we talk a lot on the show about, especially in America, people have a very short historical memory, but the way that it would give you whiplash looking at how some of these outlets have approached Azov since the war started. Um, and you've got like the New York Times, you've got Forbes, you've got again the Guardian, many other mainstream outlets actively pushing stories about how Azov denazified itself. And I probably like a standout here was when the Azov Battalion they went and did a tour of America, which featured a lot of conservative American politicians. They came to Stanford University, which had literally done its own study tracking the extremism and Nazism of the Azov Battalion. So yeah, it's really just out there. But it's also important. We look at again, a lot of Western media is just kind of a mouthpiece for the military-industrial complex. And what we see is them doing their best to patch over kind of the more complicated parts of the narrative, where America is just helping these poor, humble Ukrainians fight their war, which leaves out the fact that America has a vested interest in prolonging the war financially. Also, funding groups like Azov. I'd say like the Western news media is guilty of two big sins here. And it's it's all about historical context, and they are presenting a version of what's the Ukrainian conflict that does not talk about any of the historical context in Ukraine or the historical context of the US and how we've interacted with kind of these sorts of things in the past. And important to talk about Ukraine. And let's just kind of stick to their domestic politics here. Zelensky was elected on a peace platform. A lot of people forget that. But it was the active pillorying from the right wing and literal death threats from the Azov people and their friends that steered Zelensky into a more overtly like anti-Russian posture. And thinking about US in historical context, this has a lot of shades. I mean, we were just talking about Elliot Abrams, of the way America has financed and trained fascist paramilitaries over the decades. Again, going back to the 80s, when Elliot Abrams and his ilk was actively funding and training these paramilitary death squads in South America. We also think of, and probably an even closer analogy, the way that we trained the Mujahideen and supported the Mujahideen in the 80s when the Soviets were occupying Afghanistan. And it, replace a couple of the words, and it's almost the same story. The US government is funding violent extremists. We're papering over their fascist tendencies. There's not a Rambo movie featuring the Azov Battalion yet, but it's coming. Or I don't know, maybe modern
No.
take on that. But yeah, it's we're seeing that sort of history repeat itself when really we should all know better. Especially the media. that's been around for such a long time, and we've seen, like, we literally saw like the 30-year arc of Afghanistan, how that turned out. Um, the people controlling Afghanistan today and engaging in all the human rights abuses are the same people we funded and trained 40 years ago. And one of the dangers of the Ukraine situation that really I don't think gets talked about is, could we see a repeat of that in Ukraine? Could the sum total of this destabilization lead us to a situation where people like the Azov battalion are able to gain power in a similar way that the Taliban did? And that's a question that is going to be very important, especially for the people living in Ukraine and that region of the world, that we're not really going to suffer the consequences from, unless, maybe 20 years from now, an Azov Nazi like bombs something here in the United States. Remains to be seen. But yeah, we're seeing again a lot of the grossest mistakes of history being repeated. And not only is Western media sleeping at the wheel, but they're actively repeating those mistakes from the past willfully in order to defend how we are fighting this war in exactly the way that we are doing it. And this also ties into the fact that we've just gave a bunch of cluster munitions to the Russian, or not Russian, the Ukrainian military, which have mostly been banned in most parts of the world because it's war crime fuel. Like there's almost no way cluster munitions can't cause tremendous collateral damage to civilians, but we sent those over there anyway. And yeah, with a military that tolerates the presence of Azov. And as we mentioned back a year ago, so like America has its problem with Nazis too, but as of yet, the Proud Boys they don't have a regiment in the National Guard, at least not yet. So that's the extent that Nazism has been normalized in the political scene in Ukraine. So I don't think it's beyond the sale to say like they could come out stronger after this. And I think that's a big argument of this article is like, if we don't let the true facts of this very recent history be heard alongside the Ukrainian people's very real struggle for autonomy and peace, then we could be seeing history repeat itself in some very gross ways.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. But I do think another like at least one of the reasons why we're sending cluster munitions to Ukraine is because once the war is eventually over, there's a lot of like very very likely not just speculation, but also like they like certain business moves that are being made behind the scene that are to imply that they're gonna neoliberalize the Ukrainian economy to like a massive degree, doing a lot of sort of IMF, World Bank type, loans, a lot of privatization. It seems like they're going to try to gentrify Ukraine once this is over, like perhaps split it between the Russians one way or another. I don't know who's going to get Crimea, but whatever happens, it's not going to end up good for the Ukrainians anyways. And they are, like you said, they'll very likely end up being stuck with Azov, and that won't be good for anyone.
No. And I think just one final point is it also allows Putin to use it as a pretty valuable propaganda tool. As that journalist pointed out in their article, it gives Russia a really good tool to be able to point at a battalion like this and say, see, it's just Ukraine is lousy with Nazis. We got to do something. Y'all remember the Great Patriotic War and how we all fought the Nazis and stuff. And if you remember their recent, Russia celebrates their victory in World War II every year, and like the last one, Putin was really framing it as this great conflict is rearing its head again. And when you're able to point at things from Western media that are actively rehabilitating the Azov, that gives Putin more propagandist ammunition to try to keep more people interested, more of his population on board with the war. Because I think one of the first things they did was crush down dissent and crush down any narrative besides this one that Putin was trying to conjure like kind of this nostalgia for, you know, Russia's victory over fascism, which, you know, is kind of rich coming from a kleptocratic capitalist like, you know, Vladimir Putin. But yeah, if he's able to just gesture, you know, he doesn't even have to make it up. You could just like underline it, like, see, Stanford's inviting the Nazis over to have dinner, and now NATO's expanding. See, I was right. I was right about the threat, and we need to keep this war going. And that's something that allows, you know, Putin to do, which is also really bad for both people in Russia and Ukraine, and, you know, basically mostly Europe, because the way we're dealing with inflation, they're dealing with inflation way worse as a result of some of the sanctions that are going on as well. But yeah, it's again, if you are a person who want peace, everything that our government and our media is doing is really pushing the opposite of that. And it's almost like maybe the defense contractors are more interested in making money than actually stabilizing that region. Because, hey, more instability means more weapons and more money for Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and all the rest. And I know that sounds really cynical and maybe a touch conspiratorial, but you know, that's the military industrial complex is a very well documented phenomenon for people with more credibility than me. You know, there's a famous quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower that speaks to that. So yeah, we are in this really horrible situation where, you know, the worst tendencies of capitalism, resurgent fascism, and, you know, the needs of working people in that part of the world and other parts of the world that depend on Ukraine as a breadbasket are really being sidelined so that we can keep the conflict going, either to geopolitically to weaken Russia, or to, you know, keep the stocks up over at our lovely defense corporations.
Yeah, you can support. Yeah, you can, like, you know, you can be a supporter of Ukraine and be against the Russians' invasion without simping for the U.S. imperialism. Both are possible.
Yep, 100%. So I think that's about all I've got on that topic. But again, as I said, I'll link below not only that article from the Nation. I also do want to mention earlier this year we did a full-length conversation with Randy LaPrairie about Medea Benjamin's book, The War in Ukraine. If you want to hear us talk more about this topic, it's a full, like, 90-minute conversation where we talk about Azov and many other things, including nuclear war, which I know is a big topic this weekend with that new Barbie movie that just came out. But that's nothing. Yeah. So actually, Nora, have you seen either of those two yet? The Barbenheimer double feature.
I have seen Barbie. I've not seen Oppenheimer yet. I did really enjoy Barbie. Like, it wasn't perfect, but it was a really good movie, a really funny movie, like really yeah, visually appealing too. But it's a good fun romp, I think.
Yeah, and I say I'd have more to say, but I haven't seen either of them yet. Maybe we could do like a fun at the movies episode about that. But yeah, that is something to think about. Is, you know, these nuclear war is also a big problem with this. And again, the more we keep this conflict going, you know, this is with the world's second I don't know, largest, you want to say, use the word largest nuclear superpower. So again, while we're talking about this, there is this nuclear kind of sword of Damocles hanging over all of our heads. The longer we toy around with keeping this conflict going. And, you know, it really doesn't bode well where you have outright fascists completely in the middle of all this. I don't know, like, what in 20 years, like, say, like, you know, okay, Ukraine gets into NATO and they keep going further and further right. And they have a Nazi government, and then we have a Nazi government with nuclear weapons. That would not be a fun outcome for anybody. Which, I don't know, the way things go in America, maybe we'll have a Nazi government, nuclear weapons. But this is so on that cheerful note, any other quick hits or closing thoughts, Nora, before we wrap things up?
Yes, I do have a quick hit that's I guess unrelated. There's a lot of like bad internet bills that are going through in the federal government, and it's really upsetting. I think the most significant one that we've heard of recently is one that would require you to register your ID to use the internet at all and surveil anyone under the age of 18's use of the internet. So, and then that's not even the only one. They still have this quote TikTok ban, which is among like an encryption ban, just a lot of really concerning stuff. But I'll put in a link from the Electronic Frontier Foundation and you can look at that, see what all these are about, and you have a quick, convenient link to tell your representatives to not do that.
Yeah, and just as a quick aside, and I might have mentioned this when we reported on that TikTok story a while ago, but it's worth reiterating. Um, Millennials and Gen Z are like the furthest left, the generational cohort we've seen in about a century. Every like I'm still kind of stupefied by how quickly ideas of like socialism and workers' internationalism and communist history and all this other stuff has really returned in a very big way, and a big part of that is the internet. One main reason that I'm like a Marxist today is because I was able to find all of these books and all of these podcasts, lectures, videos, and stuff. And for this country that's been baked in anti-communism for a century, for the people in power, that's probably a very terrifying thing to see all the young people tweeting and making memes about communism and stuff. So a lot of these and socialism and just progressive politics, and it's terrifying to them. And a lot of these pushes to clamp down the internet are kind of an attempt to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak. But it is important having those resources and that information at our fingertips has really been a game changer. As much as we've talked about the gross things that the internet has done, I do still look very optimistically at the way we've been able to use the internet as an education tool. And what a lot of these bills are about are trying to take that tool away from us. And it is very, very important. I know a lot of us old school still want to print newsletters and stuff, but internet is still when an average worker can just listen to Rev Left or Media Ciphers in their headphones on their way to work. That is a game-changing tool that would make it so much harder to try to work around if we didn't have that.
Oh, definitely. And I think another reason that the government's trying to push this, and keep in mind a lot of these are bipartisan under the guise of like, oh, it's about the kids' mental health or whatever. And but a lot of this is because like the Republicans know they're cooked, like once the more of the boomers die. You know what I'm saying? Like they have like almost no youth support to keep their party sustainable. Like they probably won't be able to rig an election enough after a decade or two in order to like keep even like slight majorities up in most of their avenues. Like even with existing things like the electoral college and gerrymandering and stuff like that. So what do? They have to like ban books. They have to ban certain topics in schools, and now they're trying to go after the internet specifically because that's the main way people would get around their there already existing censorship and horrific limits of free speech. So this is we gotta like protect our internet. I know that like contacting your reps only goes so far, but again, at least we have this tool that like really streamlines it and does most of the work for you. So I would encourage everyone to go fill that out when they get the chance, and hopefully we can stop most of these from happening.
Yeah. Okay. I think with that, I'm going to close things out. Nora, thanks again. Taking time out of your day to join us in the conversation. Just a quick reminder, everybody. Again, we are online. You can find the Media Ciphers Kalamazoo podcast on most podcasting apps. We are uploading all of our content to YouTube again. I think this one will be broken up a little bit because we've got this piece. I'm doing a piece on the radio, then possibly an interview. But keep your eyes out for those. And again, tell your friends. It's how we get the word out, especially a lot of the big corporate algorithms have really downloaded leftist content over the last few years, which applies to us too. I think it was pre-2019. Some of our videos average around 100, sometimes 200 hits, and now we struggle to get like 30. I not to toot my own horn, I think the quality of the show has gone up, but yeah, just to say, word of mouth really now is the way we get this content to spread. So if you think this is a valuable show for the Kalamazoo community, please tell your friends to listen, download it, all of that, watch it on YouTube, etc. Okay, gonna go and close things out. I want to thank y'all for listening. Until next time, keep on fighting for that revolution solution.